Investment into the African tech startup ecosystem passed the $3 billion mark for the first time last year, 2022, with the space withstanding global economic headwinds to post a record year as 633 startups, according to Disrupt Africa, raised funding. Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Kenya are the premier investment destinations on the continent, though funding is also on the rise elsewhere. Now, the role of venture capital, a form of private equity and a type of financing that investors provide to startup companies and small businesses that are believed to have long-term growth potential, cannot be overstated in driving economic growth. Apart from allowing entrepreneurs to get off their feet and realize their dreams, many VC-funded firms also fall into the category of high-growth SMEs who create jobs and drive technological innovation. Despite the slowdown in VC funding in markets and the difficulty for VC firms to get limited partners, Africans are also setting up local VC firms and raising capital to back innovative companies. Now, joining me to discuss the latest venture capital trends in Africa are two exceptional fund managers. First, in our Lagos studio here with me is Lexi Novitske, General Partner at Norsken 22, an Africa Tech Growth Fund backed by an international network of tech founders and partnering with exceptional entrepreneurs. Also joining from our Abuja studio is Amaka Opara, whose firm, Wave Capital, is a venture fund that invests in female founders that are spearheading global innovation. Great to have you both on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. So I'm going to start with you first, Lexi, is just to get a sense of Thank you, Amaka. Great to have you on the show as well. So Lexi, just how much is really being raised on the continent? You saw the figure I mentioned from last year. What are these year's funding numbers looking like?
Yeah, well, things have slowed, but they've slowed on a global basis. And actually, Africa has done a little bit better relative to the rest of the world in that slowdown. So just to put that in perspective, over the past from the past year, ending in Q1, there was still $4.6 billion raised in African companies in the big four that you mentioned. And $2 billion of that actually came from Nigeria tech companies itself. Things have certainly slowed, but really this is even the only time that we've seen so far that Africa has outperformed the rest of the regions in the world. So Latin America is down by 67%, the US down by over 37%. So Africa as a whole, even if things are slowing, it's still looking quite
And why
positive.
do you think Africa is outperforming other regions?
Yeah, well, I think for a couple of reasons. One, there probably is a little bit of lag in that, but I think more importantly, the companies here on the African continent are solving really deep problems. So they're bringing an untapped, undigitalized customer into the technology landscape and providing them goods and services that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. They wouldn't be able to afford healthcare. There's just not feasibility to build enough schools at the right sort of pace. There's shortage of identity, there's shortage of financial access. So whereas in the US, you're kind of building, oh, let's get groceries in 20 minutes time.
Right.
Here you're unlocking real solutions and bringing a whole untapped consumer into the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big difference.
Okay, very interesting perspective. So Amaka, I wanted to come to you maybe to talk to us a bit more about the dynamics of how that funding is being deployed, maybe in terms of key sectors or general trends we're seeing. What is your take of how that funding is being apportioned across the African landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the key thing is that the funding is really following real opportunities and solving big opportunities. And that's sort of where you see the funding going. We all know the statistics around fintech and just financial inclusion in Africa, right? The fact that the vast majority of people are unbanked, don't have access to finance, are underbanked as well. And so you see a lot of funding flowing into fintech, but you've also seen, funding flowing to clean tech as well, understanding the fact that, we see rising energy prices. And so there's a massive opportunity now we've seen funding flowing into clean tech, but we've also seen funding flowing into health tech, and other areas in the ecosystem. So you see funding really following a lot of the big problems and companies that are solving those big problems. So that's where you see the trend in terms of sectorial focus. There's still a lot of improvement in some sectors like agri-tech, for example, but I think we'll see that coming on in following years. But I think what's interesting, to also mention is the fact that, it's really not ubiquitous when we talk about funding in Africa and venture capital, because like you said earlier, you have the big four, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Egypt, that are really taking the massive flows of the financing. And also, even at the stage of financing, you see a lot of activity at the early stages and actually at the late stages. So there's almost like, at the tail ends, right? You see a lot of funding activity. So I think there's a lot of concentration in both, at the deal size perspective. When you think about, I think in 2022 and the past 3 years, you've seen only actually the top 3 deals actually make up, almost 50% of the value of deals. Wow. So there's a lot of concentration in the market. So I think that there's a lot of, there's a lot of pockets of activity, and there's a lot more to come in terms of just different countries that we can focus on, that we'll see, and also different, how the funding is going to spread across different companies in the ecosystem. So I think we're going to see a lot more distribution across the ecosystem.
Yeah, interesting point about the volume of deals. But do you also see, Amaka, some convergence in partnerships? For instance, we're seeing a lot of clean tech companies leverage Fintech payment systems. Are those types of collaborative opportunities more attractive to fund managers or investors?
Absolutely. I think that is actually, I think if I think about fintech and the big opportunities in fintech now, it's really about embedded finance, right? And I think you don't have to be a traditional bank or fintech organization to be a fintech in the absolute sense. So I think there's going to be a rise in companies that are looking for sector-specific solutions, whether it's companies that are financing the growth and scale-up of clean tech solutions. And we've seen companies like Sunfi. You also see embedded finance in different sectors. So I definitely think that there's going to be a lot of mergers and just a lot of collaboration across industries, right? Where you're not going to see companies say, I'm solely health tech, so I don't do any fintech. So you're going to see a lot of mixtures coming out of the market, soon. So I think that's also quite exciting because it's an added area of opportunity for growth within those companies.
Yeah, great insights. Now, with all this excitement, Lexi, the data is still showing that, and it's no coincidence that I have 2 female fund managers here. The data is still showing that female CEOs are still getting a minute share of that big pot of funding that's coming into Africa. What are some of the trends? I thought we'd made quite a lot of progress over the last couple of years. So what exactly is going on?
Yeah, I mean, and those stats are even more sad because Nigeria is one of the largest rates of female entrepreneurship in the world, and a lot more venture funding should be going to female founders. I think we have maybe taken a little bit of a step back by the numbers because there were a couple of big success stories. In 2021, Andela, which had a female co-founder, raised a large percent of the capital for that year. One of the big companies, as Amaka mentioned. But we've seen that slow down certainly then follow through, in the following years after that. I think there's some success stories that haven't yet been announced yet, like Sabi, which is a fantastic company based here in Nigeria, which we invested in as well. Yeah. But I think what you're also seeing is, given the more conservative of the global landscape in venture funding now, what's becoming more important to investors is margin expansion, profitability, building a long-term sustainable business. So not just chasing growth at all costs and maybe having very aggressive cash burn rates, but really building businesses that will be around for decades to come and can be self-sustainable. And maybe I'm layering my own personal bias on this, but I think female CEOs are more likely to build that sort of companies. They're more measured in their execution. They build systems and processes.
So sorry to interrupt you, but if that's the case, is it a case of visibility or just not getting the right opportunities to pitch to investors?
Yeah, I think that is a lot of it. I think there's a bit of visibility. There's a bit of nature of what sorts of businesses a lot of women are building. They're seeing problems from their day-to-day in supply chain maybe. Whereas maybe, because the banking industry has been male-dominated for so long, maybe a lot of fintech companies are coming from male founders. But I also think that there inherently needs to be more women investing out in the market because we can not only relate to these problems, but we share the same sort of social networks and inherently probably have less bias than maybe some of our male counterparts might have when analyzing these female-led deals. Yeah. I mean, if you look at some of the data, When female founders are asked due diligence questions, they're asked things about risk, about what they'll do if XYZ happens, whereas male founders are asked about what they'll do to grow their company to be a billion-dollar company and what sort of risks they're taking on the positive side. So that sort of dynamic, I think, really changes when you unlock more female investors as well. If I can just put in a little plug, we're actually doing a program now to select and train 10 female venture capital junior members, because we think that this bottom-up approach is actually a way you need to spur the local ecosystem.
Yeah, interesting. And Amaka, I think Lexi makes a good point about having more female fund managers because they can relate to the issues. Did you experience any specific issues being a female fund manager trying to raise money from limited partners or institutional investors, because you're an entrepreneur yourself?
Absolutely. I think, those biases start from the venture capital entire ecosystem, right? So it starts also when you're looking at fund managers, you don't see as many female fund managers, right? And you see a lot of the biases start from the industry, whether it's a case of, female fund managers don't typically come from the traditional, maybe VC, PE ecosystem. And that, I think, is actually a strength in the sense that you also see a diversity of venture fund managers. But then you sort of have to do a lot of educating in terms of educating the limited partners and the investors that invest in funds to say, okay, this is the additionality that you bring to the table, with a different sort of background. I think that's a lot of that is happening, and a lot of those biases still exist in the industry. And once you see the more female fund managers, as Lexi said, you see that trickle down.
Yeah.
But I like to think about this whole gender lens investing. I think about it like 10 years ago when we were talking about investing in Africa. You would go to a meeting and the first questions you'd be asked about risk. It's always about risk, and how to mitigate those risks. And the savvy investors sort of saw through that and came into the African continent and called then frontier markets. And you've seen those returns and you've seen these great deals come out of the continent, right? So I think similarly when I think about gender lens investing, yes, we've made some progress in terms of absolute numbers, but but from a relative perspective, the numbers are still very low. We're still hovering less than 5%. So that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But then I think, again, funding always goes to, it's all about the demonstration effects and showing that this is bankable. It's not about, sometimes you think gender lens, you think immediately impact, but actually there's a huge business case. When I go back to my first principles of how to generate alpha, you really need to look at these overlooked assets that are overperforming. And that really is female founders. To speak to some of those numbers, you see actual female founders, the ones that are growing, these high growth businesses are 10% more profitable.
Yeah.
Are generating 12% more revenue.
Yeah.
Are more capital efficient because they've had to be as
Yeah.
well. But,
No, thanks.
effectively those numbers are showing. You've seen that filter. And I think we'll get more of that coming out.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm told we're almost out of time, so I have to speed us along. But I wanted you to maybe address two more things, and I'll start with Amaka and then come to Lexi. Amaka, there's a lot going on right now with the economic environment, interest rate hikes, inflation. So really, how are investors viewing the opportunities out there in the market? Are they withholding investment decisions? Is risk appetite sort of shrinking? What are your thoughts? Very briefly, very quickly.
I think absolutely there's been a slowdown in the macroeconomic framework, and people are actually a little bit more risk averse and taking things and slowing down to see how the economy pans out globally. And there are more opportunities in terms of higher interest rates abroad. So I think that's an issue, but I think at the end of the day, we focus not on the short term, but in the long term fundamentals of Africa still remain very strong in terms of mobile money penetration, access to internet. So I think that there's still, the funding will flow back, and we're optimistic in the long term.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting times there because a lot is happening globally. So Lexi, I wanted to ask you maybe in terms of the next frontier for venture capital, and particularly in relation to how you see the correlation between the type of work you're doing and economic growth, sustainable economic development. What opportunities and trends do you see on the horizon? And how are you marrying what you're doing with the whole bid for governments like those in Nigeria to really kickstart the economy, create jobs and prop up other macroeconomic and social indicators?
So I think Nigeria has an incredible opportunity in their hands. They just have to nurture it the right way. We've seen tech hubs across the world really develop in these very concentrated markets, and Lagos has become one of those. And similar to how Silicon Valley has developed, I mean, over a 5-year period in mid-90s, they added almost 250,000 jobs. Most of California's exports were actually driven from Silicon Valley and everything that was being boosted there. Nigeria has the same opportunity right at their doorsteps. Really, the government should nurture this by providing regulation that's really conducive to a lot of these tech companies to experiment, to grow, to test the market, but also encourage international companies to come in. I mean, sometimes brain drain has been seen as a huge risk, but actually if you can get the Microsofts to hire talent locally, build up that talent base, Nigeria itself will become one of the global tech ecosystems of the world. I have a lot of conviction on that. I have for the past 12 years, but it's really, I think, coming to fruition now.
And it's interesting that you keep saying tech. Is it that VCs are not investing in any sectors that are not tech-enabled? Is that really what it's about now?
Yeah, I mean, there's some, I would say, earlier stage investors that probably are a little bit more broad that will invest in physical consumer products. What we see as a big opportunity, and I think that's the only way you untap opportunities for large populations, is building lean, scalable products that you can access on your mobile device. And that goes across the board.
Thank you. So, Amaka, I have one question for you, which requires, I think, a one-worded response. What sector are you most excited by in terms of VC investing?
The future of work. That's what I'm most excited about.
Very interesting. Artificial intelligence may have something to say about the future of work. It's been great chatting with Amaka Opara, of founding partner of Wave Capital, and Lexi Novitske of Novitske 22, two incredible female fund managers doing big things on the African continent and helping to support the growth of African economies. Well, that's it from us here at Business Week. Tune in next weekend for more top stories, insights, and analysis on global business. Don't forget to send me a tweet or a thread to continue the conversation online. Have a lovely weekend. I'm Rolake Akinkugbe Filani. Take care.